Today, we're going to talk about one of Netflix's biggest tests in One Piece Season 3, the Arabasta storyline, and especially the fight between Luffy and Crocodile. Why is this story so important? Why is it so impactful that Luffy hits a truly massive wall for the first time? How should Crocodile be built as a threat? How should the 3 rounds of the fight be handled? And how big, how brutal, and how emotional should Netflix make this conflict feel? We're going to go through all of it one by one. Because if Arabasta is adapted the right way, this will not just be a new season. It could be a turning point that completely raises the level of live-action One Piece. So before we get into the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Let's get started. When the new season of One Piece live-action arrives, I think one of the things everyone is waiting for the most will definitely be the fight between Luffy and Crocodile. Because the Arabasta story is not just about saving a massive desert kingdom. It is also the point where Luffy truly hits a wall for the first time, where he feels in his bones just how big an enemy can really be, and where the audience also says, okay, now the game has gotten bigger. To be honest, Crocodile is one of my favorite villains in One Piece, because the guy is not just powerful, he's very smart, very cool, very charismatic, and at the same time he carries a very noble kind of weight. That is exactly why when the story reaches the first round that begins in the desert, it feels huge. Vivi is trying to save her country, the nation is on the edge of civil war, and Crocodile is controlling all of that chaos like a script that was written in advance. Right at that moment, Luffy stepping in front of Crocodile without a second thought to protect Vivi lays the emotional foundation of the fight, in my opinion, because Luffy is not just standing against an opponent there. Once again, he becomes the person who puts himself in danger for his friend. And that is already one of the strongest parts at the start of the first round. The way Luffy tells Vivi, "You keep going," sums up his character in one move. If his friend is in danger, he doesn't think, he doesn't calculate, he steps forward immediately. That turns that first encounter into more than just an action scene. Because behind the fight, there is a very clear emotional reason. In that moment, Luffy takes the burden Vivi is carrying onto his own shoulders once again. But the most unforgettable part of this first fight is that Luffy genuinely cannot do anything against Crocodile. When I watched the anime and read the manga, this was the part that affected me the most too. Because up until that point, we had always seen Luffy as confident, strong, stubborn, and as someone who somehow finds a solution. But against Crocodile, that feeling of confidence collapses all at once. His punches don't work, his attacks go nowhere, and for the first time you feel that Luffy is truly out of his depth. That scene is the point that elevates not only Luffy, but Crocodile too. I think this first defeat is also the best way to explain why Crocodile is such an effective villain. Because sometimes in series, villains are built up so much, but when the real fight begins, that sense of greatness disappears. With Crocodile, there's nothing like that. He absolutely destroys Luffy in the first round and makes the audience say, yeah, this guy isn't a Shichibukai for nothing. I really felt that in those scenes. In fact, this is the first time you fully accept his title, his power, and why he is such a feared figure. In my opinion, the most important thing Netflix has to do in the first fight is never soften that feeling of shock. Especially for people who only watch the live action, this moment has to feel genuinely brutal. Because until now, they have always seen Luffy as the one who gets back up. So for him to lose this clearly against Crocodile should create a "what just happened" feeling in the audience. In fact, it is very important that Luffy almost looks like he might die right there, because that is the only way you can truly feel how massive a threat Crocodile is. And on top of that, Luffy being left to die in the desert at the end of the first round completely changes the tone of the Arabasta story. After that moment, it stops being just an adventure. Suddenly everything becomes much heavier, much darker, and much more deadly. Crocodile's hook, his sand powers, and his ice-cold attitude make the seriousness of this fight feel even stronger. I think the live action should be bold here. The harsher and more devastating they make the first round, the stronger the next 2 rounds will rise. Then the second round comes, and the entire energy of the fight changes. Because this time, we are not looking at a Luffy who did not understand his opponent in the first fight. We have a Luffy who has figured out Crocodile's weak point. That is why I love the second round so much. Because here, it is not just Luffy's stubbornness that stands out, but also his intelligence. A lot of people sometimes think Luffy is just someone who moves on instinct, but he is actually a very strong character when it comes to sensing an opponent's weakness in battle. Realizing that Crocodile becomes vulnerable against water is one of the best examples of that. The moment water enters the second round is one of the most satisfying parts of the fight. Luffy is no longer throwing his punches into nothing. He gets himself wet, he gets Crocodile wet, and for the first time, that untouchable-looking man starts taking real hits. The fact that he begins gaining the upper hand in the second round against an enemy he could not even touch in the first round shows Luffy's growth incredibly well, in my opinion. If Netflix handles this correctly, live-action viewers will also clearly understand that Luffy moves forward not just through courage, but through battle intelligence too. But how Crocodile is shown here is also very critical, because in the anime, Crocodile does not come across like someone who is completely helpless in the second round. Yes, he realizes Luffy has gotten stronger. Yes, he understands that he cannot underestimate him anymore. But even so, he does not turn into a villain who panics or loses control. He behaves more like someone who leaves in order to keep advancing his bigger plan, someone who continues thinking about the bigger picture. I think Netflix needs to preserve that exactly as it is. Because one of the things that keeps Crocodile's charisma standing is the fact that he can stay cold-blooded in every situation. The great thing about the second round is exactly this. Luffy grows, but Crocodile does not shrink. That balance is very important. If Crocodile suddenly starts looking weak, then the impact of the first fight is wasted. But if you show that Luffy gains the advantage because of his intelligence and determination, then both characters feel bigger. I think that is where the writing strength of this fight really is. And if the live action builds that correctly, the Arabasta adaptation will rise to a much stronger level. As we move toward the finale, the scenes involving Vivi also increase the emotional weight of the whole story. Luffy coming back and saving Vivi again, and making her feel that she is not alone, is one of the most powerful moments in Arabasta, in my opinion. Especially that feeling of, "we will make your voice heard," suddenly breaks apart all of Vivi's helplessness. Because at that point, Vivi believes that even if she screams on her own, she will not be able to reach anyone. And right there, Luffy gives her his support. If Netflix handles this well, the emotional foundation of the final battle will feel much stronger. And another very important thing is Luffy turning to the crew and admitting that he fought Crocodile and lost. Because Luffy is not someone who easily says a defeat out loud. But here, he does it, and then he moves forward again with that feeling of, "I won't lose this time." That is why I love this part so much. Because here, Luffy has no pride, no excuses. There is only a character who knows he lost, but refuses to stay down because of it. I think if the live action keeps this scene, Luffy's growth will feel much more powerful. Once the third round begins, everything has reached the final line. Crocodile has King Cobra cornered, Robin is standing at the poneglyph, and Arabasta is truly on the edge of total disaster. As Luffy descends into that underground tomb, the whole atmosphere of the fight changes too. This is no longer just a fight. This is the final confrontation where all the tension the season has been building explodes at once. That is why the final round needs to feel big, heavy, and truly epic. One of the things that affects me most in this last fight is that Luffy is doing this not for his own country, but for his friend. The fact that even King Cobra is shocked by that is very meaningful, because what stands before him is not someone fighting for personal gain. It is a boy putting his life on the line for a place that is not his people and not his country. I think one of the things that makes Luffy so special is exactly this. Crocodile wants to control, to intimidate, to rule. Luffy only wants to protect. Another thing that makes the final round heavier is Crocodile's poison hook. Because here, Luffy is not just fighting a powerful enemy, he is also racing against time and death. The fact that he refuses to step back, even while poisoned, makes the fight feel even bigger. At this point, Luffy's endurance becomes something that is not just physical, but completely about willpower. I think Netflix should especially emphasize this part, because this scene shows very clearly why Luffy is a different kind of main character. And of course, one of the harshest details of the finale, when Luffy runs out of water and keeps fighting with his own blood. I think this is one of the biggest moments that makes the Crocodile fight unforgettable, because at that point, it stops being just about finding the enemy's weak point. It becomes, in the fullest sense, I will not give up until my last drop of blood. The fact that he keeps attacking Crocodile while there is blood on his hands, his face, and his body is both incredibly brutal and deeply symbolic. If Netflix gets this right, it could become one of the most talked about moments of the final fight. That is why King Cobra looking at Luffy in disbelief is so valuable, because what he sees in that moment is not an ordinary pirate. He sees someone who is fighting to the very end for a promise he made and for his friend's country, without any personal gain. That makes the difference between Luffy and Crocodile extremely clear. Crocodile uses people, Luffy protects people. Crocodile crushes a country for his own plan, while Luffy goes to his death to save it even though it is not even his country. Crocodile's defeat and the rain scene that follows are also, in my opinion, one of the places where Netflix absolutely has to go big. Because that rain is not just a change in the weather. It feels like the knot tightening around Arabasta's throat finally coming undone. It feels like the drought, the hopelessness, and the accumulated pain finally breaking at the end. Since the emotional visual moments like the pink snow and Sakura were handled so well in Season 2, I think they can also deliver the rain that comes after Crocodile falls in a very powerful way in Season 3. If they do this right, it could become one of the most unforgettable scenes of the season. The fact that Robin is affected by this ending and later reaches the point where she will move closer to the Straw Hat crew also makes the story even more important. Because the Arabasta finale is not just the place where a villain is defeated. It is also the point that changes the fate of a very important character like Robin. So the impact of this fight does not remain only in the final moment. It changes the direction of the series afterward too. That makes Arabasta an even bigger turning point. I think the most important thing Netflix needs to do in this fight is not keep the scale small. It has to feel many times bigger than the hour-long fight. Longer, denser, and more epic. Especially making the final round too short would be a huge mistake. Because if a villain like Crocodile is defeated in 2 minutes, all of his weight disappears. But if they properly balance the shock of the first round, the intelligence of the second round, and the sacrifice of the third round, this fight could become the biggest moment in live-action One Piece so far. So in my eyes, the fight between Luffy and Crocodile is not just the finale of Arabasta. This fight is Luffy overcoming his first Great Wall, Crocodile proving why he is a legendary villain, and one of the most critical tests that will show just how big One Piece live action can really be. If Netflix handles this story with the weight it deserves, with the right pacing and the right emotion, it can deeply affect not only anime and manga fans, but also people who only watch the live action. And in my opinion, if it is done right, this fight could become the most unforgettable event the series has had so far. Yes, guys, today we talked in detail about why the Arabasta story is so huge, why the fight between Luffy and Crocodile is considered one of the most important conflicts in One Piece, and how Netflix should handle this fight in the live action. Now it's your turn. Do you think Netflix can deliver the shock effect of the first round correctly? Can it reflect the intelligence part of the second round well? And can it make the final battle truly big, long, and unforgettable? Especially how Crocodile's threat level, Luffy's journey from helplessness to victory, and the final rain scene should be handled. Make sure to write your thoughts in the comments. If you liked the video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for new videos.